Across the United States, mountains have been measured, mapped, photographed, and climbed for more than a century. From historic expeditions in Alaska to carefully documented ascents in the Rockies, most major summits have been reached and recorded. Yet, scattered across remote ranges are peaks that remain without a verified ascent. Mountains where records show no established route, no summit registry, and no confirmed human footprint at the highest point. These summits are not avoided because of myth or legend, but because of distance, climate, and logistics. Some rise deep inside protected wilderness. Others stand among complex glaciers and fractured rock, where travel becomes a technical problem rather than a symbolic challenge. Later in this film, we will examine a little-known peak in the eastern Alaska Range, surrounded by unbroken ice fields, and a remote ridge system in the Brooks Range where aircraft access is often impossible for most of the year. Together, these mountains define the limits of presence in environments that remain mostly observed rather than physically reached. Mount Igikpak Subsidiary Peak, Gates of the Arctic, Alaska. This unnamed subsidiary peak south of Mount Igikpak rises within the Endicott Mountains of the central Brooks Range in northern Alaska. Its summit elevation is estimated at just under 7,000 feet, but its relief above surrounding valleys is substantial due to steep faces dropping toward the Noatak River basin. The peak stands inside Gates of the Arctic National Park, where there are no roads, permanent trails, or visitor infrastructure. The mountain forms part of a rugged cluster of summits aligned along a north-south trending ridge system, characterized by sharp arêtes, talus fields, and narrow cirques carved by past glaciation. The feature first entered U.S. mapping records through mid-20th century topographic surveys conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey during broader mapping of the Brooks Range. Early maps were derived from aerial photography taken during government-supported reconnaissance flights, followed by photogrammetric interpretation and ground control surveys at selected sites. Later satellite imagery refined elevation contours and ridge geometries, but the peak retained no official name and no notation of route information. Unlike Mount Igikpak itself, which has documented climbing history, the subsidiary peak remained noted only as a landform within mapping datasets and wilderness planning documents, with no recorded expedition reports or ascent references in available park or mountaineering archives. The isolation of the central Brooks Range creates the primary barrier to activity on this mountain. Access requires chartered bush flights into gravel bars or tundra benches that are often seasonal and weather-dependent. Once in the backcountry, all travel is overland through trackless terrain consisting of tussock tundra, braided river crossings, and unstable scree. Weather conditions remain highly variable even in midsummer, with frequent low cloud ceilings, sudden precipitation, and extended periods of cold wind. The mountain slopes feature fractured metamorphic rock and unconsolidated talus that offer limited anchor security and frequent rockfall. Winter conditions produce deep snow and avalanche-prone leeward faces, while shoulder seasons combine melting ice and loose debris. The logistical requirement to carry all supplies for multi-day travel without support further discourages technical attempts. As a result, the peak is rarely approached directly, even by scientific or wilderness travel parties. Human presence in the surrounding valleys is primarily associated with seasonal subsistence travel by indigenous communities and small-scale scientific fieldwork focused on permafrost, hydrology, and tundra ecosystems. Expedition records to the region concentrate on Mount Igikpak and other prominent summits, but no published reports or park records document a confirmed ascent of this subsidiary peak. A handful of backcountry accounts describe traversals along nearby ridges and passes, typically avoiding the steepest sections of the mountain itself. There are no memorials, incident reports, or search and rescue records linked to climbing activity on the summit. The absence of a verifiable first ascent does not imply total human absence, but rather reflects the lack of recorded technical attempts and the practical emphasis on valley travel rather than ridge summits in this remote environment. Today, the peak remains without a documented climbing route or summit record. Visits to the surrounding terrain are extremely limited and generally related to wilderness trekking or research rather than mountaineering objectives. Mapping references, satellite imagery, and park reports continue to note the feature only as an unnamed summit within a protected landscape, representing one of several high points in the Brooks Range with no confirmed ascent history.
Transitioning southward across Alaska, the landscape shifts from Arctic tundra to a region of expansive glaciers and steep ice-dominated plateaus in eastern Alaska Range.
2. Hayes Range Unnamed Peak 10,032, Eastern Alaska Range, Alaska. This unnamed 10,032-foot peak stands within the Hayes Range of the Eastern Alaska Range, east of Mount Hayes and north of the Susitna River Basin. The mountain forms part of a compact glaciated massif characterized by steep ice faces and narrow ridge crests. Its surrounding valleys feed into complex glacier systems that drain toward interior Alaska watersheds. The peak lacks a formal name in U.S. mapping databases and appears on topographic charts as a discrete high point positioned between larger, more frequently documented summits of the Hayes Range. The peak entered formal records during the mid-century mapping campaigns that accompanied Cold War-era geodetic surveying and aerial reconnaissance of the Alaska Range. High-altitude photography provided the first accurate delineation of its glaciers and ridgelines, with later satellite data refining elevation measurements and ice extents. Unlike Mount Hayes, which became a focal point for early climbing expeditions and scientific interest, this summit remained primarily a cartographic reference rather than an expedition target. Climbing registries, historical reports, and published expedition accounts from the Hayes Range do not include a verified ascent or established approach description for this specific peak. The mountain slopes are dominated by heavily creviced glacier systems that limit feasible approach corridors and require specialized travel, rope systems, and seasonal timing. Snow bridges and serac formations shift from year to year, complicating route planning. The surrounding terrain lacks natural landing zones for ski planes, and ground approaches require extended glacier travel from distant access points. Weather systems moving off the Gulf of Alaska produce prolonged storms, whiteout conditions, and heavy snow accumulation even during summer months. The combination of unstable cornices, avalanche-prone faces, and sustained cold temperatures adds technical risk beyond that of many more accessible Alaskan peaks. Given the absence of established routes and the availability of nearby summits with documented objectives, the mountain has remained largely unvisited by technical climbing teams. Field activity in the Hayes Range has historically centered on larger summits with mapped routes and research installations, including glaciological and meteorological work on prominent ice fields. Occasional traverses skirt the periphery of this unnamed peak during multi-day glacier crossings, but expedition narratives rarely identify attempts to reach its summit ridge. There are no recorded first ascent claims, accident reports, or ranger records referencing climbing on this mountain. Scientific fieldwork has focused instead on glacier mass balance, snow accumulation, and atmospheric studies conducted on broader plateaus where access is comparatively safer. As a result, the summit remains absent from documented human itineraries. The peak remains without a verified ascent or established route description. It is referenced in mapping and scientific datasets, but seldom appears in expedition planning or mountaineering literature. Seasonal ice dynamics, technical access barriers, and the lack of logistical infrastructure contribute to its continued status as an unvisited summit within the Hayes Range. Continuing southeast toward the Gulf of Alaska, the terrain transitions from interior ice fields to a coastline influenced by maritime storms and dense glaciated fjords. 3. St. Elias Coastal Ridge Peak, Alaska-Yukon border region, U.S. side. This unnamed peak rises along the U.S. side of the St. Elias Coastal Ridge System within Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve. Estimated at approximately 8,400 feet, it stands above a narrow ice-filled valley draining toward coastal fjords of the Gulf of Alaska. The mountain lies among a chain of rugged, steep summits positioned between the Bagley ice field and lower coastal terrain, forming a transitional zone between major glaciated plateaus and deeply incised valleys. The feature was identified through aerial photography undertaken during geological and boundary surveys in the mid-1900s. Early mapping prioritized the major peaks of the St. Elias Range, leaving many smaller but technically complex summits recorded only as unnamed elevations.
Subsequent satellite imagery clarified ridge form and slope stability, but did not alter its cartographic status. Mountaineering literature from the region largely focuses on major glaciated giants such as Mount St. Elias and Mount Logan across the border, with little reference to the smaller coastal-influenced peak. No ascent records or route descriptions have been documented in accessible archives or park reports. The mountain's location within a maritime climate exposes it to frequent storms, persistent cloud cover, and rapid temperature shifts. Snow accumulation remains high throughout much of the year, creating unstable surface layers and avalanche-prone slopes on nearly all aspects. Creviced glacier tongues occupy most feasible approach corridors, while steep rock bands above the ice are composed of fractured, weather-worn material affected by freeze-thaw cycles. Access requires extended travel across the Bagley ice field or limited coastal landings dependent on highly variable weather windows. Even during rare periods of stable conditions, visibility can deteriorate quickly, complicating navigation. Given these constraints, the peak has not become a target for documented ascents, with climbing efforts instead concentrating on more prominent objectives with established support logistics. Human activity near this area is minimal and primarily associated with scientific flights, glacier research, and long-range traverses across the Bagley icefield. Expedition reports describe passing within visual range of the mountain during ski crossings or aerial reconnaissance, but none record an attempt to reach the summit ridge. There are no first ascent claims, route notations, or incident records tied to the peak. Seasonal wildlife and protected status further limit ground disturbance, and the region's remoteness has preserved the summit as an observed rather than visited landform within one of the most expansive protected landscapes in North America. The peak remains without a confirmed ascent or established route information. It is noted in mapping datasets and visible in aerial and satellite imagery, yet continues to exist primarily as a geographic reference within an area characterized by limited human presence and difficult maritime glacial conditions. From Alaska's coastal mountains, the geography shifts south to the Pacific Northwest, where remote volcanic ridges and protected wilderness areas contain lesser-known summits far from roads and climbing corridors.
4. Glacier Peak Wilderness Ridge Point, Washington State. This unnamed ridge high point lies within the Glacier Peak Wilderness of the North Cascades in Washington State. Rising to roughly 7,900 feet along a narrow crest east of Glacier Peak, it forms part of an isolated spur between glacial cirques and deep forested valleys. The feature is distinct from nearby mapped summits, but lacks an official name or recorded route. It occupies terrain accessible only by extended trail approaches, followed by off-trail travel across steep heather slopes and unstable volcanic rock. The ridge point was cataloged during topographic mapping of the North Cascades in the early and mid-20th century. Survey benchmarks and aerial photographs defined ridge contours, but attention in climbing literature centered on Glacier Peak and neighboring named summits. Later satellite imagery confirmed its elevation prominence, but did not generate additional documentation or route detail. Historical mountaineering records, guidebooks, and club bulletins from the region contain no verified ascent accounts specific to this ridge point, reflecting its marginal prominence within an already remote section of the wilderness. Although not among the tallest summits in the Cascades, the ridge point is avoided primarily due to its location deep within a trail-limited wilderness zone. Access requires multi-day approaches and significant elevation gain over terrain subject to seasonal washouts and snow cover. Off-trail travel involves steep vegetated slopes transitioning into loose volcanic rock near the crest, where footing is unstable and exposure increases. Weather patterns in the North Cascades bring frequent storms, persistent fog, and rapid temperature changes that limit visibility across the ridge. With more prominent climbing objectives nearby and few incentives for extended off-trail travel to an unnamed crest, the feature remains outside the focus of most backcountry visitors. Backcountry travel in the area consists mainly of long-distance hikers, researchers, and a small number of technical climbers pursuing nearby named peaks.
Reports describe traverses beneath the ridge and occasional cross-country passes, but no recorded summit visits or ascent routes for this particular high point. There are no cairns, route markings, or registry references reported in available trip narratives. Wilderness policy emphasizes minimal impact and discourages the creation of new informal routes, further reducing the likelihood of unsanctioned summit travel. As a result, the ridge point remains largely undocumented in human exploration records. The ridge high point remains unrecorded as a climbed feature and lacks any formal or informal route description. It persists primarily as a cartographic elevation reference within a protected wilderness landscape where access difficulty and management priorities limit summit-focused travel. Crossing eastward from the Cascades, the terrain opens into the interior Rocky Mountain Cordillera, where isolated limestone summits and little visited ridges mark remote sections of public lands.
5. Absaroka Range Unnamed Peak, Wyoming-Montana border. This unnamed peak rises within the northern Absaroka Range near the Wyoming-Montana border, reaching an estimated elevation of approximately 10,600 feet. Positioned along a remote ridge system east of the Yellowstone River headwaters, it overlooks rugged plateaus and deep volcanic canyons. The mountain is separated from established climbing objectives by long stretches of forest and talus-covered slopes, and it appears in mapping records as a discrete but unnamed high point within a broad backcountry region. The peak was incorporated into U.S. Geological Survey topographic mapping during early 20th century mineral and boundary surveys. Aerial reconnaissance later refined ridge structures and drainage patterns, but the summit itself never received an official name or associated route record. Mountaineering attention in the Absaroka Range historically centered on more prominent, named summits closer to transportation corridors and documented trail systems. Existing guidebooks and climbing reports do not include a verified ascent or approach description for this peak, and archival references remain limited to elevation and contour data. The remoteness of this section of the Absaroka Range creates a significant logistical barrier. Approaches involve long overland travel through dense forest, unstable talus slopes, and high-elevation plateaus without established trails. Seasonal snowfields persist on shaded aspects, while summer conditions bring frequent thunderstorms and high winds across exposed ridgelines. The rock composition consists of eroded volcanic material that is brittle and prone to breaking under load, reducing anchor reliability and increasing rockfall hazard. With more accessible and better documented summits nearby, climbers and researchers have rarely prioritized this unnamed peak, resulting in minimal recorded approach or reconnaissance activity. Human presence in the surrounding region largely relates to wildlife research, backcountry rangeland monitoring, and occasional long-distance trekking. Historical accounts describe travel through adjacent valleys and plateau crossings, but do not reference summit attempts. No cairns, survey markers, or climbing route indicators have been reported on the ridge system. There are no incident records or ascent claims in regional mountaineering archives tied to this peak. Its position within remote public lands has preserved the summit as a landscape feature that is observed from surrounding high points rather than directly approached. The peak remains undocumented as an ascended summit, with no verified route or summit registry. It continues to appear only as an unnamed elevation in mapping data and wilderness management materials, reflecting its continued isolation and limited human interaction. Shifting southwest, the high desert mountains of Nevada contain isolated limestone ranges where access is limited and summit records are sparse. 6. Quinn Canyon Range High Point, Central Nevada. This unnamed high point stands within the Quinn Canyon Range of Central Nevada, rising to approximately 9,100 feet above a landscape of arid basins and sparsely vegetated foothills. The summit forms part of a narrow crest separated from nearby valleys by steep carbonate slopes and fragmented rock outcrops. The range lies far from major highways and receives minimal visitation compared to better-known Great Basin peaks. The feature entered mapping records during U.S. Geological Survey efforts to chart interior Nevada during mineral exploration and land classification projects. Early mapping relied on ground reconnaissance and airplane photography, later supplemented by satellite data.
The summit was cataloged as an unnamed elevation without associated route or trail information. Because regional exploration emphasized valley mining districts and transportation corridors, the crest attracted little formal documentation beyond topographic references, and climbing archives do not contain a recorded ascent. Unlike glaciated or alpine peaks, the difficulty here derives from isolation, exposure, and lack of surface water. Approaches require long cross-country travel through desert terrain, where seasonal temperatures fluctuate widely and shade is limited. The upper slopes consist of fractured limestone plates and loose scree, creating unstable footing on steep inclines. There are no maintained trails or established campsites, and navigation depends entirely on map and compass or satellite positioning. The absence of perennial water sources increases logistical complexity for extended travel. With few technical incentives and significant environmental challenges, the summit has remained largely outside the scope of climbing interest. Human activity in the Quinn Canyon range has consisted mainly of small-scale ranching, limited mineral prospecting, and wildlife habitat studies. Occasional ridge traversals and field surveys document movement across lower elevations, but there are no ascent accounts or route descriptions specific to the high point. No summit markers or survey monuments have been reported, and regional outdoor literature seldom references the crest. The area's remoteness and low visitation have preserved the summit in a largely undisturbed condition, with minimal recorded human presence. The high point remains without a verified ascent or mapped route. It is referenced in topographic data but rarely appears in recreational or research planning, maintaining its status as an unvisited summit within Nevada's interior basin and range landscape. From the interior desert, the final transition leads west to the Aleutian Arc, where small, steep volcanic islands create summits that are technically modest in height, yet extremely difficult to reach. 7. Unnamed Aleutian Volcanic Cone, Western Alaska. This unnamed volcanic cone rises on a remote island within the Western Aleutian chain, reaching an estimated elevation of about 2,900 feet. The cone forms part of a clustered volcanic complex surrounded by narrow coastal plains and steep slopes descending directly to the Bering Sea. The island is uninhabited, lacks permanent infrastructure, and experiences persistent wind and ocean exposure. The cone was first documented through U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey mapping, and later refined by airborne and satellite volcanic monitoring programs. Its morphology and elevation were recorded as part of broader hazard assessment and geological mapping of the Aleutian Arc. Despite detailed aerial imagery and scientific observation, no ascent records or field-based summit descriptions appear in available geologic or mountaineering references, reflecting the difficulty of accessing the island by vessel or aircraft. The challenges associated with this summit are primarily maritime and logistical. The island lacks sheltered harbors, and sea conditions frequently prevent safe landings for extended periods. Weather systems from the North Pacific generate strong winds, heavy precipitation, and low visibility. Once ashore, travel is restricted by steep volcanic slopes composed of loose tephra and unstable ash deposits that shift underfoot. Vegetation is sparse, and exposed terrain offers limited protection from the elements. The cone's geological activity history further discourages casual visitation, as fumaroles and unstable ground may be present. These combined conditions have left the summit without documented attempts. Human presence on the island is episodic and generally limited to short-term scientific visits related to wildlife surveys or volcanic monitoring, typically concentrated along coastal areas or lower slopes. There are no recorded climbing itineraries or geological field notes indicating a summit traverse of the cone. Transport constraints restrict the duration and scope of field parties, and research objectives rarely require ascent to the highest point. As a result, the summit remains undisturbed and absent from ascent records. The volcanic cone remains without a confirmed ascent or route description. It is monitored through remote sensing and occasional coastal fieldwork, but persists as a summit that is documented scientifically yet not physically reached in recorded form. Across these scattered locations, from Arctic ridges and interior ice fields to desert ranges and volcanic islands, the absence of recorded ascents reflects not mystique but practical limits. Distance, logistics, unstable terrain, and environmental conditions shape where humans travel and where they do not. These mountains exist within protected landscapes, scientific study areas, and remote ecosystems where observation from afar has replaced direct physical presence. They illustrate that mapping, naming, and imaging do not necessarily imply occupation or ascent. In an era when many peaks are extensively documented and frequently visited, these summits remain exceptions, existing primarily as contours on a map and forms in satellite imagery. They invite a broader question. In environments where access is technically possible yet rarely attempted, what defines the boundary between a landscape that is known and one that has truly been reached?